Good morning or good afternoon, whenever you get to see this. I don't know about you, but I have missed reading to all of you. So I have a book. It's called Indian in the Cupboard. It's by Lynn Reed Banks. It's one of my all-time favorite books. I loved this book when I was a 4th grader. So let's read. Chapter 1. As I'm reading, I want you to be thinking about what's going on and how do I feel about it. Chapter 1, Birthday Presents. It was not that Omri didn't appreciate Patrick's birthday present to him. Far from it. He was really very grateful. Sort of. It was without a doubt a very kind of Patrick to give Omri anything at all, let alone a second-hand plastic Indian that himself had finished with. The trouble was, though, that Omri was getting a little fed up with all the plastic figures, which he had loads of. Biscuit tins full, probably 3 or 4 if they were all put away at the same time, which they never were because most of the time they were scattered about in the bathroom, the loft, the kitchen, the breakfast room, not to mention Omri's bedroom or the garden. The compost heap was full of soldiers which over several autumns had ranked up with the leaves by Omri's mother, who was rather careless about such things. Omri and Patrick had spent many hours together playing with their joint collections of plastic toys. But now they had enough of them, at least for the moment. That is why, when Patrick brought his present to school on Omri's birthday, Omri was disappointed. He tried not to show it, but he really was. "Did you really like him?" asked Patrick as Omri stood silently with the Indian in his hand. "Yes, he's fantastic," said Omri, only in a slightly flattish voice. "I haven't gotten an Indian." "I know. I haven't gotten any cowboys either." "Nor have I. That's why I couldn't play anything with him." Omri opened his mouth to say, "I wouldn't be able to either," but thinking that might hurt Patrick's feelings, he said nothing, put his Indian in his pocket, and forgot about it. After school, there was a family tea, with all the excitement of his presents from his parents and 2 older brothers. He got his dearest wish, a skateboard, complete with kickboards and Crumptic wheels from his mom and dad, from his eldest brother. A deal. A helmet. Gillian, his older brother, hadn't bought him anything because he had no money. His pocket money had been stopped some time ago in connection with a very unfortunate incident involving their father's bicycle. So when Gillian's turn came to give Omri a present, Omri was very surprised when a large parcel was put before him, untidily unwrapped in brown paper and string. "What is it?" "Have a look. I found it in the alley." The alley was a narrow passage that ran along the bottom of the garden where their dustbins stood. The 3 boys used to play there sometimes, occasionally found treasures other, perhaps richer, neighbors had thrown away, so Omri was quite excited as he tore off the paper. Inside was a small white metal cupboard with a mirror in the door, the kind you see over a basin in old-fashioned bathrooms. You might suppose Omri would get disappointment from this, because the cupboard was fairly plain and except for a shelf completely empty, but oddly enough he was very pleased with it. He loved cupboards of any sort because of the fun that kept things from him in them. He was not a very tidy boy in general, and he did like arranging things in the cupboards, in drawers, and opening them in the later and then finding what he had just left them. "I do wish it was locked," he said. "You might say thank you before you start complaining," said Gillian. "It's got a keyhole," said their mother, "and I've got a whole box full of keys. Why don't you try all the smaller ones and see if any of them had fit?" Most of the keys were much too big, but there were half a dozen that were about the right size. All of these things were very ordinary. The unordinary one was the most interesting key in the whole collection, a small with a complicated lock part and a fancy top. A narrow strip of red satin ribbon was looped through one of its curly openings. Omri saved the key to the last. None of the others fit, and at last he picked up the curly-topped key and carefully put it in the keyhole with the cupboard door, just below the knob. He did hope very much that it would turn, regretting wasting his birthday cake cutting wish on something silly, or rather unlikely, as that he might pass his spelling test the next day, which would be real magic to bring about, because as he hadn't even looked at the words since they had been given out for 4 days ago. He closed his eyes and unwished the test passed and wished instead that this little twisty key would turn Gillian's present into a secret cupboard. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The door wouldn't open. "Hey, Mom, I found one." "Have you, darling? Which one?" His mother came to look. "Oh, that one. How very odd. That was the key to my grandmother's jeweler box that she got in Florence. It was made of red leather, and it fell to bits at last, but she kept the key and gave it to me. She was most terribly poor when she died, poor sweetie, and kept crying because she had nothing to leave me. So in the end, I'd rather have this little key than all the jewels in the world. I threaded it on the bit of that ribbon. It was much longer then, and I hung it around my neck and told her I'd always wear it and remember her. And I did for a long time. But then the ribbon broke and I nearly lost it." "You could have got a chain from it," said Omri. She just looked at him. "You're right," she said. "I should have done that, but I didn't. Now it's your cupboard key. Don't lose it, okay?" Omri put the cupboard on his bedside table. Opening it, he looked inside thoughtfully. What could he put in it? "I suppose it used to be for medicine," said Gillian. "You could keep your nose droppers in there." "No, that's just wasting it. Besides, I haven't got any other medicines." "Why don't you pop this in?" his mother suggested, opening her hand. In it was Patrick's Indian. "I found it when I was putting your trousers in the washing machine." Omri carefully stood the Indian on the shelf. "Are you going to shut the door?" his mother asked. "Yes, and lock it." He did this and kissed his mother. She turned the light out and inside the cupboard. He felt very content. Just as he was dropping off to sleep, his eyes snapped open. He thought he heard a noise, but no, all was quiet, so he closed his eyes again. In the morning, there was no doubt about it. The noise actually woke him. He lay perfectly still in the light, staring at the cupboard, which from now was coming a most extraordinary series of sounds. A pattering, a tapping, a scrambling, surely, a high-pitched noise, well, like almost a very tiny voice. To be truthfully, Omir was petrified, and who wouldn't be? Undoubtedly, there is something alive in that cupboard. At last, he put out his hand and touched it. He pulled very carefully. The door was shut tight, but as he pulled, the cupboard moved just slightly. The noise from inside instantly stopped. He lay still for a long time, wondering. Had he imagined it? The noise did not start again. At last, he cautiously turned the key and opened the cupboard door. The Indian was gone. Omri sat up sharply in bed and peered in the dark corners. Suddenly, he saw him. But he wasn't on the shelf anymore. He was in the bottom of the cupboard. And he wasn't standing upright. He was crouching in the darkest corner, half hidden by the front of the cupboard. And he was alive. Omri knew that immediately. To begin with, though the Indian was trying to keep perfectly still, and still as Omri had kept, lying in a bed a moment ago, he was breathing heavily. His bare, bronze shoulders rose and fell and were shining with sweat. The single feather sticking out the back of his head quivered, as if the Indian was trembling. And Omri peered closer, and his breath fell on the tiny huddled figure. He saw it jump to his feet. In a minute, his hand made a sudden darting movement towards its belt and came to rest clutching a handle of a knife smaller than the shaft of a tack. Neither Omri nor the Indian moved for perhaps a minute and a half. They hardly breathed either. They just stared at each other. The Indian's eyes were black and fierce and frightened. His lips were drawn back from shining white teeth, so small you can scarcely see them except when they caught in the light. He stood pressed against the inside wall of the cupboard, clutching the knife, rigid with terror, but defiant. The first coherent thought that came to his mind as he began to get over the shock was, "I must call the others," meaning his parents and brothers. But something, he not sure what, stopped him. Maybe he was afraid that if he took his eyes off the Indian even for a moment, he would vanish or become plastic again. And then the others came running and they would all laugh and accuse Omri of making things up. But who could blame him for not believing this unless they saw it with their own eyes? Another reason Omri didn't tell anyone was that if he was not dreaming and the Indian did have come alive, it was certainly the most marvelous thing that ever happened in his life, and he wanted to keep it to himself, at least at first. His next thought was that he must somehow get the Indian in his hand. He didn't want to frighten him any further, but he had to touch him. He simply had to. He reached his hand slowly into the cupboard, and the Indian gave a fantastic leap in the air. His black hair flew and the fringes of his leggings fluttered. His knife raised above his head and flashed. He gave a shout, even though it was a tiny shout to match his body, was nevertheless loud enough to make Omri jump. But not so much as he jumped with the little knife pierced his finger deeply enough to draw a drop of blood. Omri stuck his finger in his mouth and sucked it. Though how gigantic he must look to the tiny Indian and how fantastically brave he had been to stab him, the Indian just stood there, his feet in moccasins planted apart on the white painted metal floor, his chest heaving, his knife held ready, and his black eyes quite wild. Omri thought he was magnificent. "I won't hurt you," he said. "I only want to pick you up." The Indian opened his mouth and a stream of words, spoken in that loud, tiny voice, came out, none of which Omri could understand. "Do you speak English?" asked Omri. All the Indians in films spoke a sort of English. Would it be terrible if this Indian couldn't? How could they talk to each other? The Indian lowered his knife a fraction. "I speak," he grunted. Omri breathed deeply in relief. "Oh, good. Listen, I don't know how it happened that you came to life, but it must be something to do with this cupboard, or perhaps the key. Anyway, you are here, and I think you're great. I don't mind that you stabbed me, only please can I pick you up? After all, you are my Indian," and he finished in a very reasonable tone. He said this all very quickly while the Indian just stared at him. The knife point went down a little further, but he didn't answer. "Well, can I?" "Something," urged Omri impatiently. "I speak slowly," grunted the immature Indian at last. "Oh," Omri thought, and then said very slowly, "Let me pick you up." The knife came up again, and in an instant the Indian's knees bent to a crouch. "No." "Please?" "You touch, I kill," the Indian growled ferociously. You might have expected Omri to laugh at this absurd threat with a tiny creature scarcely bigger than his middle finger, armed with only a pinpoint. But Omri didn't laugh. He didn't feel like laughing. This Indian, his Indian, was behaving in every way like a real live Indian would. Brave, and despite the vast difference in their sizes and strengths, Omri respected him, even, odd as it sounds, feared him at that moment. "Okay, I won't then. But there's no need to get angry. I won't hurt you." Then the Indian looked baffled, and he said what was supposed to be in Indian English. "Me no hurt you." "You come near me, I hurt you," the Indian said swiftly. Omri had been half lying in his bed all this time. Now cautiously and slowly he got up. His heart was thundering in his chest. He couldn't be so sure why he was being cautious. Was it so frightening the Indian, or was he frightening himself? He wished one of his brothers would come in, or better still, his father, but no one came. Standing in his bare feet, he took the cupboard up by its top corners, turned it till it faced the window. He did this very carefully, but nevertheless the Indian was jolted, and having nothing to hold on to, he fell down. But he was on his feet again in a second, and had not let go of his knife. "Sorry," Omri said. The Indian responded with a noise like a snarl. There was no more conversation the next few minutes. Omri looked at the Indian in the early sunlight. He was a splendid sight. He was just under 3 inches tall. His blue-black hair, done in a plait and pressed to his head by a colored headband, gleamed in the sun. So did the minuscule muscles of his tiny naked torso and the skin of his arms. His legs were covered with buckskin leggings, which had some decoration on them, too small to see properly. He wore a kind of bandolier across his chest, and his belt seemed to be made of several strands of some shiny white beads. Best of all, somehow, were his moccasins. Omri found himself wondering, not for the first time recently, where was his magnifying glass? It was the only way he could ever be able to see and appreciate the intricate details of the Indian's clothes. Omri looked closely as he dared at the Indian's face. He expected to see paint on it, war paint, but there was none. The turkey feather that had been stuck in the headband had come out when the Indian fell. It was now lying on the floor. It was about as big as the spike on a horse chestnut, but it was a real feather. Omri suddenly asked, "Were you always this small?" "I not small, you big," said the Indian angrily. "No," began Omri, but then he stopped. He heard his mother beginning to move about the next door. The Indian heard it too. He froze. The door next to him opened. Omri knew at that moment his mother would walk in and wake him up for school. In a flash, he had bent down and whispered, "Don't worry, I'll be back." And he closed and locked the cupboard door and jumped back into bed. "Come on, Omri, time to get up." She bent down, kissed him, paid no attention to the cupboard, and went out again, leaving the door wide open. And that is our reading for chapter 1. I hope you like it, and I can't wait to read more to you.